What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Wisconsin Investor Podcast. Another week without Corey. He is missing. I am one of your co-hosts, Reese Brown, alongside my good friend Connor Derenne. And today we are going to talk about some objections, some common misconceptions, and then what actually moves deals forward in real estate. So really excited about what we have to cover today. But before we get into that, as always, a quick shout out to today's show sponsor, Wisconsin Discount Properties. So if you guys are looking for off-market deals, this is your one-stop shop every single Monday morning. Anywhere between 2 to 5 off-market deals are hitting our buyer's inbox. Now, these are deals that are not seen anywhere else. So go to wisconsindiscountproperties.com. There is a ribbon at the top. It says join the list. Fill out your information. It takes about 30 seconds. To start getting those properties. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Hey guys, Connor here. So today's episode is all going to be about real investor conversations that Reese and I have every week. We're going to be covering objections, hurdles, and figure out what actually helps move a deal forward. Every week we talk to what, Reese?
Ton of different investors, right? I'm talking probably to guys who are in the ecosystem, doing more deals consistently. You're getting a lot of guys started in this environment. So between the two of us, hundreds, I'd say around 100 probably each week.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will start, what's the biggest objection we usually hear? I don't know what you usually hear on your end, Reese, but for me personally, I'm seeing, those newer investors and honestly just any investor, they're really waiting for that perfect deal. So I guess I'll let you kick it off and see if you've been hearing the same side with investors that are doing it every day and kind of so you take from there.
Yeah. So I think where this kind of branches to right away, it's not so much waiting for the perfect deal as they don't even know what the perfect deal looks like. A lot of investors that we talk to that are kind of caught in that analysis paralysis. What do you want to call it? Like a spinning wheel, like a hamster wheel, right? Where they just are analyzing deals, consuming content, but not making the move forward, is that they really don't know what they're looking for. So a great exercise that we're doing with a ton of buyers, Connor, is just deep diving your buy box, and that's finding where do you want properties specifically, right? Being very intentional about the rehab scope of these projects, very intentional about the total purchase, right? And coming up with something that works for you. Every investor is going to be a little bit different. Yeah. But I think that's a great place to start. I don't know what you're seeing on your end. Different there.
No, absolutely. I mean, I like the part where you said, what is best for you. I hear a lot, especially with newer investors, right? Mm-hmm. What is the best route to go, right? There are so many different options. You can flip, you can do long-term rentals, you can do short-term rentals. What do I start with, right? And I think that all ties back into what you were saying with the buy box, tying it back to your initial goals, right?
Yeah.
From the start. So I think, you might even be one step ahead, right? When these people are coming in fresh, how you get to that buy box, I guess. What would you tell them?
You bring up a great point there. They come in, right? It's, BRRRR's awesome. Long-term rentals, flips. And yeah, it's all great. It's all very exciting at first, but that's the easiest way, I'd say, to get stuck in that loop that we're talking about, is when there's so much there to consume. So to get to that step, it's really aligning it with your bigger goal. Like, why did we get here in the first place? What brought you to real estate? And without having that question answered, you're never going to move to, I want to do, a flip in Green Bay. I want it to be, under a 25K rehab. You're never going to get there if it doesn't tie back to your bigger goal. So
no, absolutely. So I feel like, that is the number one objection, right? Is what is the best situation? And I think it all kind of ties back to what is the best situation for you. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're just starting out, there's so many different ways you can go about it. So the other, objection I get is, they're trying to build this big portfolio without having, a single deal. So I guess, what is it, or what advice would you give people that are just starting out? Is that going to tie back to the goals as well, or is there?
Yeah, I think it's something that Corey's talked about a number of times, right? Is reverse engineering the whole system back to the bigger goal. Because if it's not tied to that, you're going to get lost in the cycle. I mean, this stuff is it's a lot of work. It's not always fun, and if you don't have that tied in, it's going to be really hard to keep moving forward. But to get back to your question, Connor, I think Zach Morgan, who's been on this podcast before, had a great post the other day on Facebook, it was, And it's just the act of getting started is kind of the most important piece of the puzzle, right? Your first deal could be your tuition. What that means is, right, you might lose 20 grand on your first deal, but hey, a lot of guys are paying much more than 20 grand to go get an education. So that's taking a step can be, even if you lose on that first step, is definitely the most impactful. And right, going back to the objection of waiting for the perfect deal, what is the cost of waiting for that deal? I think we really tend to undervalue the cost of just sitting there and analyzing deals when there's opportunities out there. So
yeah, no, that's a really good point. Is there any, I can speak a little bit on this too, but what would you tell someone, I guess, what are some actionable steps to kind of get to that point of figuring out what direction you want to go? I know you said reverse engineering stuff. What did that look like for you, I guess?
Yeah, and this is something that you guys have heard if you've been listening to this podcast for a while. Corey preaches the bigger goal time and time again, and I think it's really easy to get away from that, especially, myself personally, a little bit more of a logistical thinker. Hard for me to always tie things back to the bigger goal, and I've gone back to it 3 times already in the first 10 minutes of this. It is identifying your why. What is going to push you to make that next step and do something? Because if that why isn't strong enough, well, you're not gonna. There's never going to be actual progress being made because you don't have a reason to do it. So I think going back, listening to a lot of what Corey has talked about in past podcasts, I think he even has one that's mainly focused around defining your why, and that is a great place to start that process of reverse engineering this.
Yeah. So. No, that's awesome. And you kind of mentioned something there too, not having a strong enough why. I feel like that's where some people kind of fall into that second hurdle I hear a lot is, I'm not ready, I'm still doing research. Yeah. At what point are you, overanalyzing a deal and, it's no longer, educational side of things, but more just a confidence side of things? Yeah,
that's hard. There's a lot to that question, Connor. Analysis paralysis, though, is such a easy trap to fall into, right? It can feel very productive to be consuming content like this, right? Real estate content, reading books, and there is definitely room where that is super helpful, right? All of us got our start by doing that, by listening to Bigger Pockets. I know is what a lot of people started with, myself included. And I think you draw that line, right? There's not a yes or no when you draw it, but most folks that I've talked to, at least, when they're saying no, they're ready, they have everything lined up, they have their financing, and every deal doesn't work for them. I think that's a really good time to have a long hard talk in the mirror with yourself and be like, wait, am I just telling myself these aren't working because I'm scared to do it? Which is something that we both see, and I'm sure, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I'm sure you see that as well in the conversations you're having with newer investors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest hurdle they have is just that lack of confidence, more or less, than anything. I feel like, especially my story, I learned a lot. I learned a lot more in the last 8 months doing my rehab and working on my duplex and talking through the deal and actually being hands-on than I did in my 1.5 years of listening to podcasts, reading books, which will kind of tie into something that we're going to get into a little bit later too. Networking has been a huge part for me as well to kind of get over that hump.
No, that's a really good point. Is the amount that folks learn, even with you've seen the guys go from, hey, I'm kind of interested in this, no idea what they're doing, to getting deals. And what is the difference maker usually them actually getting into their first property? Where do you see the biggest kind of leap for people's personal development when it comes to real estate investing?
No, I love that question. So what I've seen, honestly, is just the small and perfect action that people are making. So my initial conversation that I'm having with investors every single day is, first, like we talked about in the beginning, what's your goal? Why is that goal important to you? What is your why behind it all? There's other ways to make money outside of real estate. So why is real estate important to move that vehicle along to get you to your goal, right? So I always start with that. If your why is not important, like you said, this isn't going to be, a long venture for you, to be honest. But with that being said, going back to the small and perfect action, let's say your why is strong, right? You want to get into real estate. Where are you at in that journey? Have you talked to lenders? Have you, went to networking events? Are you looking at deals? Have you ran numbers? And you can come here and be green, not know any of this stuff, just have, strong enough why. And after a conversation, it's all about just taking those little actions. Typically we're diving into lenders, is kind of the first step, right? Let's get connected with people. Real estate's a relationship game. I'm sure you've seen that.
100%.
But I would say where I'm seeing that difference is the people, after having that conversation, whether it's with me, you, or, whoever you're talking about real estate with, after you have these conversations, don't let it die there. Move that needle along, make another phone call, read another book. You got to keep moving it forward, because otherwise, if it's just an idea and there's no action, it's just going to stay an idea.
It's just going to die out. No, 100%. And I think it perfectly branches in, Connor, to a piece that we definitely both wanted to talk about on here, and that is the networking piece. And personally, right, you know this about me, I was not a fan at all of these networking groups. I probably had a poor experience in college. Was in a real estate club, and much different, right? It's commercial acquisitions and stuff like that we were talking about in this real estate club, but nothing felt very productive. And got up from down in Madison to some of the networking events we have here in northeastern Wisconsin, and I think everyone I have hired, or at least the first 5-6 people I had hired to do work on my property, has been through meeting them at a networking event. So the power of those, right? It can be a drag to spend a weeknight instead of spending time with family, finding a sitter and going to these events. That can be one of the most difficult decisions to make. But the impact I've seen it make on my own business and so many others is, it is probably the biggest needle mover in this. And then I would assume you would say something similar here.
Oh, I would 100% agree. The true power is you're getting that firsthand experience. You're talking to people that are doing it every day. Let's say you're not to a point where you're ready to, put your own money into it, get your first deal, right? This is a great chance to get that hands-on experience without actually, investing your own capital, right?
Yeah.
You're getting tuition for free here.
Yeah.
You might have to pay a little bit to get into the networking event,
but
it's pretty much free.
Yeah.
But with that being said, it's the same thing, about moving the needle, right? You can show up to these networking events and kind of just hide in the corner, right? And yes, you're going to get some knowledge, but basically you might as well stay home and read a book, watch a podcast. The true power isn't, if there's a panel, right? It's not listening to that. Yes, those are great. Those are awesome. But the true power is the connections in those networking events. I mean, how many times have you went and talked to one guy and, our woman, right? Talk to a person, and then you get more contact. It's a spiderweb effect.
100%. And so many of them are connected, right? The people that you're being referred to are also, folks who are actively making the choice to come to these events, take time out of their weeknights to come to these events, which I think you're finding the best of the best. And that leads me to some of the other events that we have around here in northeastern Wisconsin, and that is the caffeine and cash flows, right? These are intentionally put in the middle of a work day, right? So the folks that are showing up to these events are definitely dedicated to investing in real estate. So you're talking to some of the best, guys who are very serious, guys and gals that are very serious about investing in real estate. So I think going to those it will continue to be one of the most underrated things. It's so easy to, think of the access that we have on the internet now, to just, rely on that and fall back to that. It is so much more convenient. I agree. But there's so much left out of, human contact when it comes to, moving the needle here. So,
yeah. Just to, go further into depth on that too. If you're new, right, and you go to these networking events, sometimes you feel like you have no value, right?
Yeah.
What was that like when you first got into it? I know you've been doing it for a little bit now. Do you remember what that felt like and how you kind of, where did you provide your value? Because I know in my episode I talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think back. It's been a minute. I mean, going back to what I had said though, I was so like, I don't want to be here. Like I didn't see the value in it at first. So for me, it was a slow learning curve to when I finally made the realization that the folks that I was talking to the folks that I had met at these events were the ones that I was hiring to, either, do a project or do, some sort of rehab on a property, or that I would call for advice on something I had going on. Once I made that connection, I was like, wait, everyone that I've been calling, I've been meeting at these events. That's when I was like, oh wow, this really is doing something for me. So.
Yeah.
What were you saying the last time you had talked to Corey about it?
Yeah, so for me, it was, especially being new, right? Talking to these, some of these people who are buying, multiple deals a month or a year, right? They're doing it day over day. They have a whole system in place, and then here comes, just a fresh little kid out of college, like, hey, I want to get into real estate. But just like asking the questions, not being afraid, being vulnerable and asking questions. I truly don't think there's ever a dumb question. And if someone is taking something and telling you you're dumb, like that's not someone you want to network with. That's not someone you want to work with anyway, and just cut the ties there. But I feel like all the people I've met, I've never really ran into too many bad eggs at these events. I feel like our community, especially in Northeast Wisconsin, is very uplifting, willing to help. There's enough deals to go around. I don't know if you can.
I couldn't agree more. And branching into that, just our network base as a whole, going outside of who's actually at these events, we have. In Wisconsin, we have some of the best financing options, some of the best community banks, which at first I had taken for granted. I was like, as I got into it, I got my start here in Green Bay area, and that's just how I thought, a lot of lending practices were across the country. Same with property management. And what I've learned is some of the community banks we have, the hard money lending options we have, right? Shout out to Good Faith Funding being one of them. Others out there too that are great, but that doesn't exist in other areas of the country. Going to property management, we have so many options for it and so many affordable options for it, which is another piece of this network, right? We're talking very specific now here to northeastern Wisconsin, but I lived in Milwaukee I just moved here a couple days ago, right? So I lived in Milwaukee for years. All my properties up in Green Bay. And it was no stress at all. It would have been harder for me to manage properties down where I was living, just because of the network we have here. So investing remotely is something that's definitely doable here because of this amazing network that we have. So
well, you said two things there that actually are other hurdles that I've heard on calls that I really want to get into. You mentioned being in Milwaukee, buying deals in Green Bay. So I feel like that is another thing I hear all the time. People, we go back, let's tie this all together right here. We're defining our buy box. People are very definitive sometimes, which is great, but when does that become a problem? And, now my buy box is so small that I can't find a deal. How was that, buying deals that were an hour and a half away from you?
Yeah, right. The buy box is such a gray area, and I think it's always good to talk over your buy box with someone else, because you could so easily fall into the trap of, tangling your buy box up to just keep yourself safe from buying a deal, right? That can be your excuse, is your buy box. So I think the best practice around there, this is going to answer your question as a whole, but the best practice is if I create my buy box and I go a month looking for deals everywhere and I'm not finding anything no deal is fitting my buy box, it's probably time to sit down and look that over again. If the numbers are never working, there's probably a reason for that, and it might be within how you drew that up, and then that's a good time to revisit. So
no, that's awesome. And then you were mentioning lending options, especially at networking events. You've been saying there's a lot of great options. Something I hear on the new buyer side, and I'm wondering if you hear anything similar, but people are, always saying they need a lot of cash to get started. And obviously there's two sides, it's going to tie back to your goals, right? But what would you say to someone that's like, hey, I want to get into this, I just have no cash, I can't put 20% down on a house. Like, we have a bunch of, different lending options, obviously. We've talked about those 100 times, but how do you get past that fear, I guess, of, not being traditional with your ways?
Yeah, this is such a funny one, and it's made me kind of realize that the financing side of real estate is more of a mindset than anything. I've seen, some of very consistent investors, right? They're buying, 5+ deals a year, or 5+ flips, rentals, whatever it is, and they're, very, very rarely do they have much of their own money into these deals. Their risk tolerance might be a little bit higher, but then I'll have another conversation with someone who, they are financially in a great spot, but their risk tolerance is much higher, or their fear of what that looks like. The best way to start is just to start talking to these lenders, lay out your situation. It's like an interview almost as you're talking to a lot of these commercial banks, but you can, give them your backstory first. Here's where I'm trying to go. Here's what I got. How can we work together to make this work, right? And if you don't have those conversations with lenders, you're never gonna make a step forward there. So it's just, and then once you open your eyes to, oh my God, I have this, I only need X amount down. They're gonna fund, we have some lenders here, northeastern Wisconsin, that will go up to 80% of the ARV and cover the whole purchase price. That exists, right now. And once you're like, wow, I have this in writing in front of me, that gives you so much confidence to go out and actually put bids on properties and actually, start making steps forward. So.
Yeah, and then for you, and we were talking about this a little bit before we got rolling here, you actually ended up partnering with your brothers to get started. Is that that's the route you went? Was that a cash thing, or was that just confidence thing? I guess. Yeah. Where did that decision come into play?
That came in right. We had talked about it for a while. Really close with my brothers, so it was for me. I was still in college, so definitely a cash thing for me. Being in college, I needed some help on that end, but. Right, there's pros and cons to it. A huge pro for me is I deal with a lot of the numbers. I find a lot of the deals for my brothers. One of my brothers does all the work on the properties. The other one does the management. So it's a perfect team. Now, on the other side of it, right, is one of the biggest things in real estate is appreciation. I talked about it a lot last week on the podcast, and now I'm only getting 1/3 of the appreciation on these deals. So there's pros and cons, but to get started, I was not confident enough to do it on my own. I wouldn't have made a step. There's a good chance I would still be sitting here without any deals if I had not, had my brothers to help, I'm doing it with them. It took a lot of the scarcity away. So starting with a partner is better than not starting at all, in my opinion. And
you can do this, you did it with your brothers, right? So you kind of already had that foundation built, but that kind of ties back to the networking then too. If it sounded like confidence was kind of your thing, and you put a team around you, and that gave you that final push that you needed.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just had a conversation with an investor last week. I hear this a lot where it'll be someone very, very qualified, but they have that same, they're like, I'm not ready. I don't know enough to jump in on my own. And they're looking for a partner to do it with them, just to take, some of that risk away. And for me, it was, taking some of that risk away. So that exists. And where's a great place to find those people at networking events, right? Not to keep plugging that, but no, all the time you hear folks talking about the power of partnerships, and there's pros and cons to it, of course, like anything. But for me, I can honestly say I have no idea if I would be, at a point where I'm buying properties consistently if I didn't start with a partner. So.
Yeah. So we talked, I feel like majority of this so far has been, a lot of objections and hurdles, especially tailored towards those newer investors, right? What are you seeing on your end of things? 'Cause, just to kind of reiterate, I'm, most of my conversations are with people trying to get into the game, just starting out.
Yeah.
You're more hands-on. You're talking to investors that are doing it quite a bit, if I'm not mistaken. What does that side of the conversation look like for you? What kind of hurdles are they overcoming at this point?
Yeah, once they've done a few, and Connor, I'm talking to guys too who are, maybe they're a deal in, okay. So it's still pretty fresh for those guys too. But that hurdle, it always changes. What I'm seeing right now is a lot of folks who just, I can't make the numbers work right now. Especially the folks who might have seen some really good times in the past couple years, their expectations of higher cash flow, right? Those deals aren't going to work as much in the market we're in, and that's just the fact of the matter. So one of the huge ones I'm seeing right now is just, I can't make the numbers work on anything. And I talked to someone this morning who active real estate investor, haven't bought a deal in about 2 years. And they can't make the numbers work. It's not like they're doing anything wrong. It's just they haven't sat down and reconsidered, what is the market calling for right now? What should my expectations be? Why does this still make sense? And I did talk about this a lot last week, so I'll keep it shorter here. But going back to on your side of things, Connor, What do you see for common objections for some of the newer guys? Maybe we covered a lot of these already, but is there anything you would add there?
Yeah, I mean, so we kind of dove into it, right, with, defining the buy box. I think a huge one for people, figuring out what that perfect deal is for them, which I know we covered a lot already. But with that being said, when do you take into consideration, the market in the play here? Like you said, the market is shifting. So how do you tie that back to your goals, right? Do you have any, because has your buy box changed at all in the last, because what have you been doing this 3-4 years now?
Yeah. Buy box, your I wouldn't say your buy box as much as your big goal changes too, right? My big goal change, like you got to sit down and look at that every 6 months or so, because your goals are going to change, right? Before getting married, my goals are different than now I'm married, right? So things change. And yeah, into the market we're in now, right? What I'm personally seeing is I think we're going to lose a lot of competition for other investors, just because cash flow isn't as strong as it used to be, and some people are not going to adapt to not cash flowing, $300-400 a door. Some folks won't, and that's going to create some more opportunity for us. So for me, it's like, hey, if I can get into something and do the burr process, pull a lot of my cash out, and then at least break even on the cash flow, I'm a happy camper, because that is just going to appreciate year over year. I'm using leverage to accelerate my appreciation, right? Instead of my 5% return on appreciation, it's 25. So just going back to the basics of why am I doing this in the first place? And for me, it's all long-term wealth building. So
awesome. The other thing I hear, right? So I know we talked about the perfect deal, right? And you probably see this more than I do, right? What is it like talking to these people that are buying deals? Are they going for that home run? Are they stacking base hits? Do you see, any pros and cons in those two sides of investing, right? I mean, there's people waiting for that perfect deal they can get, X amount of money on. What's your advice for something if someone's trying to build their portfolio faster?
Yeah, the common theme of all of it is the most consistent, successful investors that I'll talk to, all of them across the board. There's not really an exception that I've seen so far. They will not use like the current market, as that won't be the excuse for not buying something. It would be, hey, based on my personal life right now, maybe right now is not the best time for me to buy. They might take some breaks, but it is never like, hey, the market's not looking too great right now, so I'm going to wait. That is something the most successful investors, I've never heard that before. So what about on your side of things?
For me, I mean, so a lot of these people that are first getting into it, they're looking for that home run deal, right?
Yeah.
They're looking for that deal that was going to just launch them from 0 to, let's get my next deal right away. So, it's just, and it's all going to always tie back to what your goals are, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes, taking that base hit and taking, stacking those, right? And, it might be a couple deals before you get, that home run deal, right?
Yeah.
But like it goes back to that imperfect action, right? You're going to get tuition during these deals.
Yeah.
So I guess,
there's going to be parts of this, right, that suck at the beginning. And I think going back to the guys who've been doing it for a while, right, they know it sucks. They still, right, there's, investors that buy, tons of deals every year, and they still have one or two a year that they get burned on, even though they've been doing this forever. It's like, oh, well, you live and you learn. If I wouldn't have taken, the 10 chances I did, I wouldn't have had my 8 wins, right?
Yep.
So that happens across the board. Like, it's not real estate, it's free money. It's real estate investing for a reason. So I think that is, you got to be okay with that when you're getting started, that it could be a tuition. You might not get the home run to start, but as we both talked about, the biggest needle mover is just starting somewhere, just doing something is huge. So
yeah, another hurdle, and I'm curious to see what your side of things are on this as well. People starting to build their portfolio, right? So I talk to a lot of people that they got a couple deals under their belt. Might be house hacking, might just done a flip or two. But mainly people that have 1 or 2 rentals and are looking for more deal flow, right? So they might have been working primarily on MLS, got a few deals from people they know, maybe from some wholesalers as well. But what does it look like, trying to build that portfolio and, getting the right mindset on that side of things, because people are trying to protect what they built sometimes too. And you almost get overly cautious after you've already done it a few times. You're like, whoa, things have been going good.
Yeah.
I don't want to mess it up. So can you speak a little bit? Have you ran into that as well, or is that just something I'm seeing,
I haven't seen as much of that. I'd be curious to and maybe if you explain further, maybe an example of what you've seen, because I haven't seen too much of that. I guess, what have you seen in that?
Yeah, I've just talked to a few people, and it's not a crazy handful, but it's been enough where I wanted to bring it up. They might have got a couple deals off the MLS, and it worked out well, right? There's still good deals to be found on the MLS. Yep. You just got to search for them. Let's say they got a deal from a family member, got a good deal on it, and now all of a sudden they kind of launched this little, created that little itch, to get more, right?
Yeah.
But now they're at a point where like they kind of done it. Maybe they just don't have the experience.
Comfortable with.
They're not quite comfortable with it. So now they've had a point where they have 1 or 2 properties, right? And they've maybe not done it, enough still. And maybe that's where, they're kind of holding back. But there's just a fear like, hey, I already have a few properties. It's going well. I want to scale, but how do I do that, smart? So I guess it'd be more on like the system building side of things, I think, where their issues are coming in. And it's almost a fear of losing what they've already created.
Yeah, and that's where I think something that Corey, again, on this podcast has talked a lot about, and he's a master at it, is building your team, not trying to be, run the show just on your own. And that's where, finding someone who, when you're analyzing these deals, right, who's your guy that you're going to call to, look this over for you, give you a rehab budget, or who are the couple of guys to do that. And when you build your team that way, it gives you a lot more confidence to go forward when you're not relying solely on yourself. I think that's another place that if you're seeing that more often, and maybe this is something I've been blind to, maybe it's been happening and I just haven't seen it, is having a partner. Right, some of the guys who are doing 10+ deals a year, they're doing these all with partners. Multiple guys that I talk to are doing it with a partner, whether it's their spouse or someone else. A lot of them, it's just a buddy or something like that, someone that they've met over the years that they're investing with. So that can take away some of the risk too, and make it easier to get it rolling. So.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Now that I've kind of talked it out loud and through with you, it's just funny because I realize it's probably a system thing more than anything, more than lack of confidence. I guess it's different from having 1 or 2 properties, right? You might be managing those yourself. You might have someone else be doing it for you, but as you start to build, you're going to have to shift how you do it.
Yeah. 100%. Well, Connor, I think we can probably wrap things up here. I don't think, unless you have anything else that you wanted to cover here, I think we've covered a lot. I think the basis, in my opinion, kind of to summarize everything we've talked about, is taking action over not taking action is going to be your most important piece. And if you're still in that analysis, paralysis spot, at least start going to networking events and start exposing yourself to that, because I know firsthand and through a lot of stories that I've heard, that can be